My students will tell you that I like him a little bit. The Death of Roosevelt. This is a lecture. It's meant to have several themes. It might whet a concern for the health of our presidents. Just think of the presidents of the 20th century who have had serious health issues, and of those that have tried to hide those issues. And Roosevelt hid them better than any of the rest of them. Or the lecture might show my high regard for President Roosevelt. And it might merely interest you to discover more about the subject. I do hope I won't bore you. This is a lecture, not a paper. At times, I no doubt will be too close to the words of other historians and have used their phrases. I know I've used their ideas, I relied on their sources, and even some of those faded classroom notes that, according to some of my colleagues, would disintegrate if they dropped to the ground. I relied on biographies of Roosevelt, Brands, Friedel's, Morgan's, Fleming's. I've used a relatively new volume by a physician and an editor on Roosevelt's deadly secret. April the 12th, 1945, just 69 years ago, 3 days, 3:55 p.m., Central War Time. Franklin D. Roosevelt died, and whether you loved him, and there were millions that loved him, and whether you hated him, and there were millions who hated him, that message from Warm Spring, Georgia affected you just almost as if you had received a black rim telegram from the War Department. An America without Roosevelt seemed inconceivable. If you were an adult, he had been a part of your life for the last 12 years. Most Americans simply wept open and unashamedly. I don't remember Roosevelt's death. Dr. Wilson, no matter how old you think I am. But my mother tells me I was in the kitchen playing with my wooden cars when my grandmother and mother cooking dinner heard the news, and they started crying, and I started crying. And Mother said, "Why are you crying?" And I said, "Daddy, I guess Daddy's dead." And she said, "No, the president's died." I said, "Oh." So I started playing with my car. Let me briefly describe Roosevelt's last days, and let's make a judgment of him. February the 27th, the USS Quincy put into Newport. FDR went straight to the White House. He's a very tired man. He had spent a grueling month attending the Yalta Conference, the last meeting of the Big Three, meeting with Churchill and Stalin, the last meeting before Europe was conquered, the end of the war in Europe. He's worn out, as you can tell. He's emotionally upset. The death of his military aide, his court jester. and a regular poker table buddy, Paul Watson, General Watson, his military aide. He died. Watson died of a cerebral hemorrhage on the return trip. His daughter Anna had accompanied him on his return from Yalta, and she was concerned with her father's demeanor. She had strong evidence he was failing. She had talked to the White House physician, Ross McIntyre, and McIntyre had been somewhat, and I say somewhat, honest with her and her father's condition. And she told one of Roosevelt's administrative assistants that she was going to restrict his activities. You know, there's a suggestion of regency about Anna. Trying to protect the president from the outside world, like Edith Galt Wilson and Corey Grayson had done with Woodrow Wilson. Roosevelt might have known of his own approaching death. On his arrival to Washington, he threw himself into preparing a report to Congress. His appetite failed again. He claimed of not being able to taste his food. He lost additional weight. He grew more haggard. On March the 1st, he addressed a joint session of the Congress. He's rolled into the well of the chamber, and he's transferred to a chair. And he looked at the congressmen, the senators, and the Supreme Court justices. He says, and I hope you will pardon me for this unusual posture of sitting down. But I know you will realize that it makes it a lot easier for me not having to carry about 10 pounds of steel around my bottoms of my legs, and because of the fact that I've just completed a 14,000-mile trip. This is the first time that Roosevelt has ever referred to his handicap in public. There's only one public picture of Roosevelt in a wheelchair, and that was in 1938, a March of Dime poster girl. I guess at the time he's not contemplating another term. A lot of people in the United States didn't even know that Roosevelt was unable to walk without aid. During this speech before Congress, he had trouble turning the pages. His right hand was not working. He rambled on, ad-libbing. He lost his place from time to time. It was not one of his better performances. In fact, he was not seeing half the words. More of that later. Those around Roosevelt continued to give the illusion that he was in excellent health. He was continuing to keep a calendar of visitors. Outgoing War Mobilization Director Jimmy Brines of South Carolina expressed this illusion. He and General Lucius D. Clay, Eisenhower's deputy in Germany, had a meeting with Roosevelt. And after the meeting was over, in which Roosevelt rambled on and on, giving Clay or Brines no time to speak at all, Brines said to Clay, he said, General, you talk too much. And Clay said, I was so shocked watching him that I don't know if I could have made sense of a reply. Mr. Brines, we've been talking to a dying man. Brines replied, you're crazy. He's been like that for a long time. In fact, Roosevelt's health was very bad, and Brines knew it. So did others who had contact with the president. In fact, Roosevelt's health had been in decline for a long time. Over a year before, on the 27th of March, 1944, Dr. Howard J. Brune, this gentleman right here in the Navy uniform, a cardiologist at the Naval Hospital in Bethesda, examined Roosevelt and found Roosevelt suffering from acute bronchitis, cardiac failure of the left ventricle, high blood pressure, and heart disease. Roosevelt's regular White House physician, Ross McIntyre, had earlier found some of the same symptoms, and in fact, he had pulled some strings to have Brune transferred from a ward officer in a boot camp to the head of the cardiology department at Bethesda, in effect to make Brune Roosevelt's cardiologist. After this date, Brune saw Roosevelt at least 4 times a week, cut his intake of cigarettes to 5 to 6 a day, his alcohol to 2 or 3 cocktails an evening, usually. And they put him on a semi-strict diet. When I say a semi-strict diet, it was actually a diet to try to get him to gain weight. Brune also gave him a large amount of codeine for his cough. Hereafter, Roosevelt was to take a nap each afternoon. Roosevelt was also examined by Frank Leahy, founder of the Boston Leahy Clinic, perhaps the most famous surgeon in America. He was examined by James A. Paulin of Atlanta, a former president of the American Medical Association. Both men confirmed Brune's treatment. Now, Leahy later said he told Roosevelt that he had a monastic tumor and advised him not to run for another term. Of course, he said this in 1965. That's well after the fact. Of course, McIntyre, all this time, is claiming that Roosevelt is of, as he claimed, the best of health. As the 1944 campaign, by the way, when Brune is talking to Roosevelt, when he's with Roosevelt, administering to him, etc., this is well before Roosevelt announces for his 4th term. This is before he announces for a 4th term. So he's still within the 3rd term, and he's a very sick man. As the campaign of 44 began, Roosevelt invited his vice presidential running mate, Harry Truman, to the White House for lunch. Truman thanked him. He said, thank you for putting the finger on me for the vice presidency. Now, think of that, putting the finger on me. That's an interesting choice of words. Fingering people during the 20s and the 30s meant execution gangland style. Back in his Senate office, Truman confided to an assistant, he says, I had no idea the president was in such a feeble condition. Roosevelt has vetoed me campaigning by airplane, exclaiming, one of us must stay alive. Quote closed. At various times during the campaign, Roosevelt suffered from angina, and he's not a very good patient. By 1944, members of the press corps could see a definite change in Roosevelt. His health, his stamina had become a legitimate topic. Look at him here, giving his acceptance address to run for the presidency in '44 by radio. The press discovered that Brune was a regular member of Roosevelt's entourage. The press noticed that Roosevelt had lost weight, that he had displayed a gaunt face with his lower jaw at times hanging down. To convince the public of Roosevelt's vitality, campaign managers planned a 4-hour campaign swing through New York City and a speech at Ebbets Field. Of course, Ebbets Field, the home of the Brooklyn Dodgers. It couldn't have been a worse day. It was a windy, teeth-shattering day. It poured constant rain. Roosevelt braved the elements for 51 miles, hatless in the back seat of an open Packard. What the public did not know was that at several points along the route, the president's automobile was turned into the warmth of a garage. He was undressed. They put fresh clothes on and fed a lot of brandy. And then he sped cheerfully along to the next stop. On March the 24th, Roosevelt had gone to Hyde Park for a few days. He returned to Washington on the 28th, and then he was leaving for Warm Springs, Georgia on the 29th. He's suffering from a cold, but actually he's suffering from congestive heart failure. He complained of not being able to taste his food. He's also having repeated seizures and severe stomach aches. These seizures are not new, just more frequent and causing temporary unconsciousness. The first seizures had occurred at the Tehran conference in November the 28th through December the 1st, 1943. This is the meeting of Churchill, Stalin, and Roosevelt, the first meeting of the big three. In all probability, the seizures and the stomachache were caused by cancer. FDR indeed did have cancer, malignant melanoma to be exact, originating in the pigment lesion above the left eye. That eventually metastasized to his brain and his abdomen. And Roosevelt knew by 1940 that he only had a window of opportunity before the cancer consumed him. Cosmetically, the lesion, over a period of 4 years between 1939 and 1943, is surgically removed at Bethesda with no record or fanfare. In fact, there are records, but they're aliases. F. David Rolfe, Fred D. Rosen, F. David Roy. There's a White House physician's name and others that were associated with Roosevelt. By 1942, the lesion had fairly well disappeared. Now, if you look in 1944, you see Roosevelt with a real bushy head, with a real bushy eyebrows. In October 1944, you don't see a lesion over the left eye. In 1930, you don't see a lesion. In 1938 and 1939, you definitely see the lesion, and it is very, very pronounced. 38, 39, 42, nothing. 41, you see it only a slight lesion, and you know it's 1941 because he's in mourning for the death of his mother, Sarah. Of course, that's, I put the Roosevelt stamp, reminding you that we'll never see a 32-cent stamp again. At various times, Roosevelt received blood transfusions, as many as 8 in a period of 3 months in 1940. These conditions had not happened suddenly. Roosevelt is a very sick man before the end of his second term. He is battling anemia. He's battling internal bleeding. Eleanor Roosevelt later claimed her husband had prostate cancer, and that could explain the bleeding. Radium, a treatment for prostate cancer, could initiate internal bleeding. Whatever the cause, the bleeding was not stopped for several months. Brune would later describe the anemia, which occurred at least 2 years before he began treating the president, as profound. Roosevelt's medical problems then were sufficient to kill him before the end of his third term. It's interesting to speculate now, and I love to do this. I mean, F's a mighty big word, but it's interesting to speculate. If Roosevelt had not run in 1940, then perhaps John Nance Garner or James Farley would have gotten the nomination. John Nance Garner was 72 years old. Farley was a Roman Catholic. That meant that perhaps Wendell Willkie or McNary, the vice presidential nominee, could have won the election. Willkie dies Willkie has a heart attack, dies at the age of 53 before the end of the third term, and McNary dies of a brain tumor before his term ends. That would mean that whomever Willkie had chosen to be his Secretary of State would have been President of the United States. You would have had a president unelected during the Second World War. And what if Roosevelt had run and been elected and then died? Oh me. We would have had to put up with Henry A. Wallace, his vice. Roosevelt also, you got to remember, Roosevelt is more concerned with domestic affairs than he is with foreign affairs. It's shown by his vice presidential nominees. Truman surely was not his first choice for vice president in 1944. On the day he leaves for Warm Springs, Roosevelt tells a New York columnist, Ann O'Hare McCormick, that he no longer believed that what he had told Congress about the confidence he had in the arrangements made at Yalta. He said that either Stalin was not a man of his word, or he did not have control of the Soviet government. This is a flippant statement, not in his usual makeup. At Warm Springs, he's so tired for the first days that he can only sit in his chair with a book in his hand. He stares without expression. His mouth is partly open. His cousins, Margaret Daisy Suckley and Laura Delano, are staying with the president. He has with him his physician, Dr. Brune, his secretary, Grace Tully, his valet and butler, Arthur Prettyman, several others in the party. He doesn't regain any of his strength until the 3rd. He began signing some papers on the 5th. He had a visit from the president of the Philippines. After lunch, he gave his 998th press conference. He said he was looking forward to attending the San Francisco conference on the 25th. On the 9th of April, widow Lucy Rutherford arrived from Aiken. She had with her her friend, the society painter, Elizabeth Mopsy Shomatoff, whom she had commissioned to do a portrait of Roosevelt. Lucy said, "He's so thin and frail, but having lost so much weight, his face looks the way it did when he was younger." Roosevelt's going to spend the last days with the woman he might have married had he followed the inclination of his heart, the woman he swore to Eleanor he would never see again. And it wasn't the first time that year that he had seen Lucy. Once in South Carolina and once at the White House, which had been arranged by his daughter, Anna. It's also interesting that Daisy was also at Warm Springs. And Daisy had been one of Roosevelt's friends, had several romantic liaisons with the president over the years. On the 11th, Roosevelt worked on the Jefferson Day speech, which he was to deliver on the 13th. That evening, Henry Morgenthau, Secretary of the Treasury, came to dinner, and he was shocked at the appearance of Roosevelt. He said his hand shook as he mixed cocktails. He started knocking over glasses when he poured. His memory was bad. He was constantly confusing names. On the morning of the 12th, Mopsy set up her easel. Roosevelt emerged at noon. Laura Delano, Daisy, and Lucy watched. Arthur Prettyman brought the president a bowl of gruel and cream, which Roosevelt called his green cocktail. As Mopsy painted, the upper part of the president's face, Roosevelt suddenly raised his hand and passed it over his head several times in a strange, jerky way. He said, "I have a terrible headache." Without a sound, he slumped in his chair. "I have a terrible pain in the back of my head." Prettyman and his assistant took the president to bed. Mopsy and Lucy ran out to find Dr. Brune. Lucy said, "We better leave. It wouldn't do for the press to find us here." By the time that Brune arrived, 10 minutes later, Roosevelt was unconscious and sweating profusely. His heart rate was 96 beats per minute. His blood pressure was 300 over 190. Spasms caused his body to twitch periodically. His right pupil was greatly dilated. Through medication, the physician brought the blood pressure down to 210 over 110. He called McIntyre in Washington. McIntyre called Paulin. Paulin arrived from Atlanta at 3:20, but he could do nothing either. At 3:35, Brune pronounced FDR dead. One of Roosevelt's administrative assistants, William Hassett, wrote rather movingly, he said, "In the quiet beauty of the Georgia spring, like a thief in the night came the day of the Lord. Of course, I had seen it coming for too long, but little thought the end was so near." The official bulletin would announce with moving simplicity, "Army, Navy dead. Roosevelt, Franklin D., Commander-in-Chief." After a state funeral, FDR was finally laid to rest at Hyde Park in the Rose Garden. His grave was only a short distance from where his wicker basket is hung as a baby. There would be no more fireside chats, no more 100 days, no more brain trusts, no more third and fourth terms, no more Grand Alliance. One thing was for sure. No president would look at the office again as presidents before FDR. At 5:05, Harry Truman was in Sam Rayburn's office at the end of the day, having a bourbon and branch with the Speaker of the House, when all of a sudden the Speaker's telephone rang, and that's most unusual because the Speaker was not to be interrupted during that time of day. And Sam said, "Harry, it's Steve Early. It's for you." Steve Early said, "Mr. Truman, come to the White House." Truman said, "Harry, I've got to go to the White House today. I'll be back in just a few minutes. They want me to enter through the front door." He's ushered into Mrs. Roosevelt's study. She put her arm around his shoulder and said, "Harry, the president's dead." Rather stunned, Truman said, "Is there anything I can do for you?" And she responded, "No, Harry, is there anything that we can do for you? You're the one that's now in trouble." Truman would take the oath at 7:09 p.m. Eastern Wartime. In his office, Sam Rayburn looked out on the dwindling afternoon light, his right hand in a half fist. Tears are welling in his shrewd face and his rounded face, and he's saying, "Now the son's a gun. We'll dance over his grave. Well, let them try." And many have tried. But Roosevelt seems to have weathered the test of time, and in the late 50s, 50 of the most eminent historians all but unanimously agreed that in the roster of presidents, Lincoln stands first, Washington second, and Roosevelt third. And today, the consensus still stands, with Roosevelt at least in the top 10. For all of his flaws, foibles, and follies, and there were a manifold, sufficiently many of them, he deserves supreme credit as a statesman who saw deeply into the moment of history. The world we live in today is Roosevelt's world. It's not the world of Joseph Stalin. That world vanished before our very eyes. It's not the world of Winston Churchill. Empires and glory have long since vanished into the past. It's not the world of the 1,000-year Reich, which lasted for 12 years. The world we lived in is to his making to a great extent. He transformed the United States. The New Deal lives in so many ways, from Social Security to TVA, from FDIC to REA, from subsidies to tobacco and dairy farmers, to a viable alliance of labor and minorities within the Democratic Party. This man with a crippled affliction had led a crippled nation that became the most powerful nation in the world. His methods, direct, experimental, and pragmatic. His New Deal gave the United States a social order at home and a new order in global affairs. The United States emerged from a nation of individuals to a socially minded nation accepting the principles of the welfare state. It changed from an isolationist nation to one committed to world partnership and world leadership. Now, in all of these words of high praise, there's another side of Roosevelt, but I'll leave that for another time. With the help of his physicians, FDR was determined to stay alive for the time needed to accomplish his goals and to convince this nation that he could function at full capacity. Yet he had to know that the odds were against him. In 1940, Roosevelt took one of the greatest gambles in American history. He ran for a third term and he won. In 1944, he acquiesced to deleting Henry Wallace from the ticket in favor either of William Douglas or Truman. Did he know what he was doing? I'd like to think that he did. But at that time, I'm not quite for sure. Thank you.